Okay, factoring out the greatest common factor. And factoring by grouping. Now, this is the first two types of factoring that we're going to go over. And we're going to begin with factoring out the greatest common factor. Now, to factor out the greatest common factor, you have to first be able to find the greatest common factor. So let's say we have something like this. 6x to the third minus 9x squared plus 12x. And we want to factor out the greatest common factor. What we do first is we look at the numerical part of each problem, the coefficient of each term. We have a 6, a negative 9, and a 12. So what we want to do is we want to find the largest number that divides into all three evenly. So the largest number that goes into 6, 9, and 12 evenly would be 3. Okay. Now if there wasn't a number, if 1 was the only thing that went into those numbers, you wouldn't have to put 1 out here. Okay, now they also all have an x. Now if they all don't have an x, x won't be part of the greatest common factor. But since all of these have an x, x will be part of the greatest common factor. Use the lowest power of x that you see. So we have x to the third, x squared, and this x, which is x to the first. So use just plain x. So that is your greatest common factor. So you just find the number that goes into all three. If they all have an x, just use the lowest power that you see. And then you go back and you divide everything in the original problem by 3x, and that'll tell you what to put in parentheses. See, what we're doing here is we're just doing the distributive property backwards. So when you divide this out, you have 2x squared, your first term. When you divide the second term, you have 3x, so minus 3x. And when you divide this last term, see the x's are going to cancel out there, so you just have 12 divided by 3 is 4. And you can check yourself by multiplying it all back out to see if you get the original problem. But that's how you factor out the greatest common factor. Let's do one more. Okay. 14x cubed y plus 7x squared y minus 7xy. Okay, let's look at the numerical part of each. We have 14, 7, and 7. The largest number that goes in all of those is 7. They each have an x. The lowest power of x you see is just x to the first. They each have a y. The only power of y you see is y to the first. So 7xy is your greatest common factor. So now we're going to divide each term in the original problem by 7xy. Now when you divide the first term by 7xy, that gives you 2x squared. Remember, you subtract those exponents when you're dividing. And the y's completely cancel out on that one. Plus, now this one the 7's cancel and the y's cancel. So x squared divided by x would just be x to the first power, which is just x. Okay, and everything cancels out on the last one. So that's going to give you 1. Anytime everything cancels out is 1, because you know if you divide something by itself, it gives you 1. So that's your answer. Okay. Now sometimes you have a polynomial factor to factor out. Let's say you have 6 times x plus 2 minus y times x plus 2. Now on this one, the greatest common factor is x plus 2. That's what they have in common. Okay. Now if you divide each one by x plus 2, see that would cancel and that would cancel, and you would just have 6 minus y left. So that's your answer, x plus 2 times 6 minus y. Make sure you have both of those in parentheses. Let's look at one more like that. So you have xy times y plus 1 minus y plus 1. So on this one, your greatest common factor is y plus 1. So I'm going to write that down. Now, if you divide this first term by y plus 1, they cancel. And you can divide this one by y plus 1, and they cancel also. So you would have xy, there's your first term here, because I saw this left in the first one, minus, and remember I said when everything cancels out is 1, because if you divide something by itself, it's 1. Or also you could think of this, you know, if you have something in parentheses here, there's always an understood 1 to be in front of that parentheses. So you can think of it that way too. Okay, next is factoring by grouping. Okay, we're going to factor this one by grouping. X cubed. Let's do this other one first. Do that one in just a minute. Let's do 2x plus 18 plus xy plus 9y. Okay, now there's not a greatest common factor for every term, so you can't factor out a greatest common factor. So what we're going to do here is factor by grouping. If we group these two together, they have a common factor of 2. And if we group these two together, they have a common factor of y. Okay. All right, so if we group the first two together, we see we have a common factor of 2. Write the common factor down and open your parentheses behind it. Now go back and divide those two terms by 2. The 2's would cancel there to just leave you with x plus 18 divided by 2 is 9. Okay, now look at the next two. The greatest common factor there is y. And since there's a plus in front of that xy, your greatest common factor is going to be a positive. So we're factoring out a plus y. So go back and divide each of those by y. So that cancels and that cancels. And that leaves you with x plus 9. Now if you do it correctly, you should always get the same thing in both sets of parentheses. And once you get to this point, it's like problem number 4. See, they have the x plus 9's in common. So you would write that down. And open your parentheses. And if you go back and divide this first term by x plus 9, you just have 2 left. If you divide this other one by x plus 9, you just have plus y left. You could also just think of that as if you take the x plus 9 out, what would be left? That's what you put in the other parentheses. If you take the x plus 9 out, you'd have 2 plus y left. Okay, let's look at x cubed plus 4x plus x squared plus 4. Okay, if you group these first two together, you can factor out an x. So if I factor an x out of this first term right here, if you divide that by x, that leaves you with x squared. And if you need to still write it over x to figure it out, you can do that. Plus, if you divide this term by x, it leaves you with 4. Okay, now if we group these two together, they don't have anything in common, so we're just going to factor a 1 out. So x squared divided by 1 is still going to be x squared, and 4 divided by 1 is still going to be 4. Now we got the same thing in both parentheses, so we know we're doing it right. So just write the x squared plus 4 down, and if you factor that out, the x plus 1 is all that will be left over. So that's your answer, x squared plus 4 times x plus 1. Okay, let's do one more problem. Two x cubed minus x squared minus 10x plus 5. If we group the first two together, the common factor there is going to be x squared because they have the x in common, and the lowest power of x in those two terms is x squared. If you divide this first term by x squared, and like I said, if you need to write it, you can. That's going to leave you with 2x. And if you divide this one by x squared, that leaves you with 1. We'll group the last two together. Now, since the first term here that you're factoring is a negative, then you need to factor out a negative greatest common factor. So we know it's going to be a minus, and 5 would be the greatest common factor there. Now, if you divide negative 10x by negative 5, that leaves you with 2x. And if you divide 5 by negative 5, that leaves you with a minus 1. And then we just need to finish it up. So you have your 2x minus 1 in common, so factor that out. If you factor out the 2x minus 1, x squared minus 5 is left for the other parentheses.